Hi everybody. So joining me today we have Dr. Azar Gat. Dr. Gat is the Ezer Weizman Professor of National Security and Chair of the Department of Political Science at Tel Aviv University in Israel. He is the founder and head of the university's Executive Master's Program in Diplomacy and Security, and is also the author of books like A History of Military Thought, War in Human Civilization, and Nations. Hi, Dr. Gat, how are you doing?
Thank you. I'm fine. I'm the former chair, by the way.
Sorry? I didn't get
Former
it.
chair of the department.
Oh, okay,
Doesn't
okay.
matter. Okay, good.
Okay, thank you for that correction. So, okay, so to start off with, today I guess we're going to talk about war, war in human civilization at least, because we also have war in other primates, I guess. So, would you say that we could consider war as something that is part of human nature?
Yes, but it depends on what you mean by that. There used to be a debate, or there is still a debate, on perhaps most people think that we are kind of instinctively inclined to war, that we can't help it, that people are by nature aggressive, and therefore war is a kind of automatic response into which people fall from time to time. This is wrong. And the evidence that this is wrong is that we have societies. The cliche has it, the Swedes and the Swiss who haven't fought for centuries and still do not exhibit any signs of distress on that account. So it's not a compulsion in the same way that, say, the instinct, the desires for food or for sex are, that we feel pressurized to have them. And you don't need the Swiss and the Swedes for that. Most of us live in, at least in the West and in other developed countries, live in countries where there is no war, and also are quite happy about it and do not feel distress. So it's not that people, have this compulsion to go to war. What is in our nature is that the capacity to wage war. Basically, we have three means of achieving our ends, our objective. That is, by peacefully cooperating with others, by peacefully competing with others, and by violence. And people calculate which avenue is most likely to be most profitable. That's why in some conditions, social condition, historical condition, people figure out that it's, more advantageous to go to war. In other, they prefer peaceful means and so forth. So the capacity to use violence is in our nature. It's like the hammer in our toolkit. But our toolkit also consists of other instruments. So it's in our nature as a means, not as an end.
Mm-hmm. So, but I mean, there are some evolutionary bases for for different groups of humans, let's say, to wage war against each other. So, for example, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, it is true that in all societies that have been studied until now, people wage war against each other to obtain resources, like material resources, and
Yeah.
also for the men to have access to more women, and also to acquire perhaps prestige in their respective societies, right?
Yes, as far as we can judge, we do not have perfect information on all societies. So some societies are in peace for various periods, and we don't have we cannot judge what happened in other periods in some obscure societies, and there were many on the globe until recently. So yes, so evolutionary, we have what I say is that we have the machinery necessary for waging war and reason why we do it. But we also have the machinery for peaceful cooperation. So yes, evolutionarily we have them, we have both of them. And it depends on the circumstances, which of the machineries we find more advantageous to employ at any particular moment.
And so, would you say that the reasons I pointed out are reasons that we usually get from why people wage war against each other,
Sure.
and perhaps other ones could be revenge, deterrence, and things like
Yes.
that?
Precisely. So yes, as you said, people want precious, scarce resources, say like food, on other things that are of high value to them, and they want access to sexual opportunities. All this is an evolutionary rationale that applies not only to people but also to other animals. But once you have it, there is also suspicion that the other is going to attack you one day. You don't know if he will, you don't know if he won't. So on top of these, there are other causes of war which are an add-on on the first level of causes. That is, this is called the security dilemma. The security that the other might attack you, but I mean, even if he doesn't, you are not sure that he's not going to do it because he might want your food, or he might want to steal your women and so forth. So in all societies, then we see all pre-state societies, we see these factors at work, and in a different way also in state societies.
And would you say that war is mostly a man's affair and not really a women's affair?
It used to be the case for various reasons. First of all, sexual competition between men is stronger than between women because men have the capacity to have fruitful, that is reproductive, sexual intercourse with unlimited number of women, whereas women do not profit in the same way, and also because, and this is associated with the fact that men are stronger. So historically, yes, men were those who waged war, even though women were also involved in the sense that they depended on the booty that the men brought, on the fate of the men. So it was a collective enterprise in the sense that everybody had interest in the war, even though it was waged almost exclusively by men. It's changing now because you don't need physical force as much as previously, even though still it is the case that women show lesser propensity, lesser inclination to join the military, even though, in many fields of the military they are now equally treated.
Okay, so with the development of agriculture and the advent of the Neolithic, human society in terms of structure completely changed. So I guess that to introduce this theme here, I would like you first of all to comment on the differences in terms of war. I mean, in terms of the prevalence of war, and in terms of the percentage of men that died in war conflicts. First of all, comparing hunter-gatherer societies with pastoralist societies.
So I'm not sure that the difference is strong here. What the advent of agriculture actually did is to create class society, that is, differences in property and larger scale societies. So whereas hunter-gatherers lived in groups of no more than around 500 on average, the tribal group, agriculture society started to grow in size, and at the end they developed political structure, that is hierarchical political structure, that is states. and the states continue to grow in size. So what we have is an asymmetrical relationship between the poor in society, the rich in society, the rulers in society. We begin to have taxes, and we begin to have regular armies and large armies as a function of large societies. But paradoxically, mortality in war actually declined during the states. And it's paradoxical. It goes against our intuition because we are used to have, a spectacular number of dead in state wars. But what we need to consider is not absolute size or number of dead, but the percentage of dead in the population. So if you have state societies of millions, the actual percentage of those finding death in war is actually lower than among hunter-gatherers. Among hunter-gatherers, about 25% of the men and about 15% of the population usually found death, violent death. Whereas, and this is the average only for the most severe state wars. Usually the average is much lower in state wars. And there are various reasons for that. One of the reasons is the actual size of states. So in tribal wars, the whole tribe is exposed. Whereas in state wars, the front is usually hundreds of kilometers away. So, so the civilian population is more protected unless the invasion reached the depth of the country. And this is the reason also why civil wars are the most destructive, the most lethal of wars, because the warfare takes place within the societies. So the destruction and exposure of the civilian population is much higher, as we see unfortunately today in Syria and obviously throughout history.
Mm-hmm. Comparing societies after, let's say, the development or the advent of agriculture, because people tend to characterize pastoralist societies as being particularly violent in comparison with other societies which have agriculture at their basis. So, in pastoralist societies, it's easy or relatively easy for people, if they wage war against one another, to take the herd animals with them, and they don't have to settle in the specific place where, for example, people that have certain kinds, that have agriculture at their basis, they have their plantations there, and so if they are conquered by other people, they have to settle at least a certain number of people there. But in pastoralist societies, they can simply take the animals with them, right? So
that's true, that they can simply rob the animals in a successful war. But agriculturalists too fight for territory. I would say that pastoralists have this particular and partly justified bellicose image, because they can prey with almost immunity on the agricultural neighbors. Pastoralists among themselves are both exposed to each other, so they are more weary of starting a struggle. But but pastoralists throughout history, especially horse pastoralists, especially in the Eurasian steppe, the Mongols, the Turkish tribes, and so forth, they could prey on their agricultural neighbors, on the great civilizations of, say, China or Persia or Europe and so forth, or Russia and so forth, and they could, the neighbors could not pay them in kinds because they were unable to catch them. They were mobile, and it was a one-way prey relationship between pastoralists and agriculturalists.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so again, comparing pre-state societies and even pre-agricultural societies, and state societies or agricultural societies. So would you say that we can put all together under the same rubric all types of agricultural societies, like, let's say, chiefdoms, kingdoms, and even the empires, and compare them all together with pre-state societies or pre-agricultural societies, and say that all these different kinds of agricultural societies are induce, let's say, in terms of war, less deaths and less casualties in proportion than pre-state societies?
Yes, so state societies historically were prone to war, and they fought a great deal of the time, by and large, with some variation, of course, but still they were fighting a lot. But as you say, as compared to pre-state societies, they suffered less mortality in relative terms, that is, relative to population, than small-scale societies, for the reason we've just mentioned. That is, that small-scale societies are more vulnerable. And they also have state societies, by being large-scale, also have a smaller capacity to mobilize the population. I mean, they can only mobilize, say, 10% of the population, because the others are needed in the fields and so forth. So the problem of logistics, of growing food and so forth, is greater for state society. So both because of the relative size of the armed forces and because of the lesser exposure of the civilian population, state war, although ostensibly, apparently large scale, very spectacular in scale, in actuality cause less casualties than pre-state societies.
Mm-hmm. And so, would you say that when we have centralized power and big societies, that even though a fewer number of men die in war, that it is easier for the people in power to mobilize men to go to war in comparison with what is possible in smaller societies and even pre-state societies?
It is easier in terms of compulsion, since they have the authority and command authority over their societies. It's easier in terms of compulsion. There is lesser compulsion, except for social pressure, and except for kinship relationship in tribal societies. Usually people help their friends and kins, but are less not feel themselves obligated to join if it's not their immediate relatives and so forth. This is often the case. But in state societies, they have the rulers have the authority, the ability to, by the threat of punishment, to induce people to go to the military. On the other hand, but at the same time, it's more difficult to maintain the armies. I mean, it's again easier in terms of the taxes that you can levy, with which you maintain the armies. But in terms of the logistical difficulties, it's a heavy burden. With tribal societies, people simply leave their homes for a day or two and go a few kilometers and fight with their neighbors. Here, you have to create the entire infrastructure, or logistical infrastructure, so that you are able to maintain such armies away from home.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and now that we're talking about states, we can also perhaps talk about statism and even nationalism. So, for the first question I would like to pose is, because some people, I guess, have the idea that nationalism arose in the 19th century. But even before that, we already had at least some types of nationalist prototypes, let's say, right? So, for example, in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. It's the fashion, has been the fashion since perhaps the 80s, sometimes earlier, to equate nationalism with modernity. And obviously, nationalism has changed in modernity because of the changes that modernity brought with it. But the idea that people did not feel affinity to the kin in terms of nation is absurd. And nationalism, they had a national identity. They know. So nationalism existed since the beginning of statehood. Just an example: the first large-scale state is ancient Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, it's that the Egyptians knew that they were Egyptians, and they knew that the others outside Egypt were foreigners. And every form of ritual in the temples, in the in festivals, and so forth, emphasize this point that the gods were the gods of Egypt and foreigners were foreigners and so forth. So the idea that the peasant in the fields had no idea of him being part of an Egyptian people is absurd, and it was advanced by theorists who did not actually have good acquaintance with the actual history of the people concerned. Obviously, not all states were national. Part of the states were smaller, that is, they were city-states. So, for example, in Greece, the Greeks knew that they were all Hellenes. That is, that they all belonged to a larger ethnos, which were the Greeks, but that their political units were only part of that nation. So they were aware of this, and they were aware of the difference between the political identity and ethnic identity. And also you had the multi-ethnic empires, which brought together a variety of ethnicities. But even in these empires, there was usually a dominant ethnos, or a dominant people, which by force of arms made the others subservient. So it's not that ethnic national affinities, identities did not exist between modern. And the same for Europe. China is another ancient nation state. Japan is one. Korea, on which we hear so much these days, is also a very ancient national state, which fought both the Chinese and the Japanese throughout history for liberty. The Vietnamese fought the Chinese for national liberation for more than 1,000 years. And there are many other cases. And obviously in Europe, there are many old nations in Europe which emerged with the emergence of states in Europe in the early Middle Ages. It depends. So for example, the Scots and the English and the Swedes and the Danish and the Poles and the Russians and the Czech are all examples of old nations which emerged already in the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm. And so would you say that what people refer to when they talk about what happened in the 19th century, for example, with the unification of Germany and Italy, would you say that that is much more a process of unification and then to try to get all that people to look into the same, to have the same national identity than really to talk about that as being the first historical development of nationalism?
As I said, modernity made a difference. First of all, the concept of popular sovereignty as the main legitimizing principles of states rather than the authority of kings. So if it's not the authority of kings, but national popular sovereignty, the will of the people. So the people, once asked about it, showed a strong affinity towards belonging to their own nation state. And by the way, if we talk about Germany or Italy, so at least in the case of Germany, it's not that the German state appeared in the 19th century. It's the second Reich that was created in the 19th century. But during the Middle Ages, there was the German Empire. It was called the Roman Empire, but it was because the Roman title was very prestigious, so and every ruler wanted to have this imperial title. But what it was in effect was a German state with some imperial ambitions outside the states, but still the electors of the German emperors, there was a college of electors that elected the German empire, were always the German princes. With only one addition, and that was the Kingdom of Bohemia, that from the 14th century was also German. So all of them were German, and it also was all based. And again, if you look at the disintegration of the empire of Charlemagne, of Karl the Great, the fact of the matter is that it was divided along linguistic lines. The German part became the German Empire, and the Latin-speaking part became what was later to become France. So the breakup occurred along linguistic and ultimately national lines. So, and there were other changes during the 19th century that made the popular voice stronger. For example, the migration from village communities where people, were impotent to affect the political process. They were, as Marx called it, they were like potatoes in a sack. That is, they were they were the object of the political process rather than being able to influence it. So once there was urbanization with industrialization, people moved to the cities and were more capable of expressing their views. And remarkably, surprisingly, these views turned out to be national.
Mm-hmm. And so, what would you say was throughout history the influence an ideology like nationalism played in the development and justification of war? So, to give a concrete example, what would you think was the importance of the development of this kind of national identity? What influence did it have in the development of the world wars?
Throughout history, not only during the world wars, but obviously from the 19th century it became even more accentuated, but throughout history, national identity, ethno-national identity forged was a major factor in not only in fixing borders between political identity, but as a factor in solidarity. So people would regard foreigners as a threat, and in case of conflict, they would join up. Take Russia, for example, which was, a very despotic state. The people have no say. They were subjugated by the aristocracy and by the Tsar, who was a despotic ruler. They had absolutely no. So according to the modernists, they had no notion of being Russians, the Russian peasantry. But still, when Russia was invaded by foreigners, so say by Poland in the 17th century, by the Swedes in the early 18th century, and most famously by Napoleon in 1812, the Russian population rose against the invaders, and with great enthusiasm. This was a patriotic feeling, and obviously when it was necessary, usually the rulers did not want to rely too much on the masses unless the masses would have ideas that, that there were things that they wanted in terms of rights. But at a time of emergency, the rulers would call upon the natural patriotic sentiments of the people in order to fight invaders. So Russian is an example. So in terms of both borders and solidarity that could be counted on, the political ethno-national divisions always played a huge role. And as you said, during the 19th century and during the 20th century, wars of national character, that is, waged in order to unify a country, join with your kin across the border, became perhaps the major cause of warfare during first in Europe and then throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that nationalism was a cause for war, or more of a justification for war? If you understand the differentiation I'm trying to.
Both, I would say, but it was during the 19th and 20th century. It was very much a cause. That is, people sought unity. They wanted to come together in their own state. They wanted to join with to free themselves from foreign rulers. They wanted to join with their kin across the borders. So the kind of wars that we see in the 19th and 20th century were other kinds of war, were other reasons for war, were partly in decline, is mostly national.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and talking about another type of ideology, let's put it that way, religion. What has been the role of religion throughout history in terms of causing and justifying war? So perhaps we could talk here about what happened during the Renaissance period with the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation, if you want, of course.
Yeah, ideology has always been a factor, and before modern times, ideology was mostly religious. That is, one's picture of the world and how we humans have to conduct themselves in the world has always been a major factor for people, and religious differences matter. They mattered because in many times they also coincided with ethno-national differences. So the other people had different religions, and they were also foreigners. So this religious feeling cemented national identity. In other cases, it was ideology per se. We do not accept that Catholics or Protestants had the right view of how people had to conduct themselves in the world in order to please God, and people throughout history have been driven to war on that account. So yes, that also was a major cause of war throughout history.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so now talking about recent trends in war. So since World War II, we've been having a historical phenomena that we call the long peace, right? So what would we say have been the main reasons behind these phenomena? Why states since World War II haven't been waging war against each other?
Okay, so first, our audience may be surprised to learn that there have been no wars since 1945. So we might better first explain that we are talking about great power wars. The great powers no longer fight each other. And this is new because throughout history, the great powers are the greatest warriors. They fight more than others, and their wars are the most destructive. So this is This has been called in the 80s, 1980s, when scholars have begun to pay attention to the fact that the great powers do not no longer fight each other. This has been, as you said, termed the long peace, and we have now reached the 73rd year without great power war, and hopefully this will continue. So when people notice this, the explanation for this lack of warfare between the great powers seemed obvious, and this is the nuclear factor. Since 1945, we have the nuclear bomb, so people, the great powers fear mutual annihilation by the bomb, so they do not fight each other. But what scholars have not noticed is that before this long peace, during the 19th century, we had two other periods of long peace between the great powers. That is, between 1871 and 1914, we had no war between the great powers. This is 43 years. And the third longest peace between the great powers occurred just earlier, that is between the end of the Napoleonic War, 1815, and 1854. This is 39 years of no peace, of no war. And this is certainly a novelty, because if you look at the 18th century or the 17th century or any century before, you see that the great powers were fighting all the time. So we have something here changing. People always knew that the 19th century was particularly pacifistic. And you also have the long peace after 1945. So we have a change here, and the problem is to explain why it has occurred, and also to explain the great exception to this change, which is the two world wars, which are quite an exception. So this is the challenge. And most people think that modern war has become rarer because it is more costly or more destructive or more lethal, so the powers are more cautious. But this is not the case. Earlier wars in history were as destructive and as lethal in terms of percentage of the population killed as even World War II, relative to the population. I repeat, not in absolute terms. Absolute terms, World War I cost perhaps 60 million dead, but this is a war that occurred around the world, so it doesn't matter if it's one war that is occurring around the world, or there were a variety of wars that happened in various places throughout history. So what we are asking is the relative number of deaths. So for example, in the 30 Years' War in Europe, 1618 to 1648, it's estimated that in Germany between 15 and 30% of the population perished, which is more than what Germany lost in the First and Second World War combined. And the same in other wars. I don't know how much you want to go into examples. Say the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage. So in the first 3 years of the war, 218 to 216 BC, war lost 25% of its military manpower, which is more or less the same as the Soviet Union lost during the Second World War out of its military. And the Soviet Union suffered the most horrendous casualties of all the belligerents in World War II. So it's not that war, the same applies to the economics of the war. And in pre-modern wars, the destruction often brought famine. So people died in numbers because of famine and destruction, the destruction of Germany again, or destruction of Russia and China during the Mongol invasion of the 13th century was huge. So if it's not that modern wars became more lethal and destructive, the question that we must ask is, why has war been declining in the developed world during the 19th and 20th century? This is the question that I'm trying to answer.
And you touched on nuclear weapons. Would you say that nuclear weapons have played a role of deterrence?
Yes, of course. It would be silly to say that nuclear wars did not contribute to the trend. Obviously, they did. It's as they say, about the hanging rope. They concentrated the minds of all those involved wonderfully. But we see that the second longest peace and the third longest peace both occurred before the nuclear era. So there were other factors that must have affected the trend.
And so we're still not sure about what those factors might be.
Well, I have my answers. If you want, I'll tell you what my answers are. What I see is that the trend is occurring since the beginning of the 19th century, since the industrial age. And what we have been experiencing since the beginning of the industrial age is a huge rise in wealth. That is, the wealth has been doubling and doubling again, so that by now we are 30 to 50 wealthier than we were in 1800. Yeah, very comfortable now. So what this means is that wealth is no longer a finite quantity. Until 1800, wealth was a finite quantity, and the only way to obtain it is to get more of what your neighbor had. So this is this is called the Malthusian trap. There is that the resources are finite. Even what you gain by increased productivity is consumed by a growing population. So it's all very finite and very abysmal, as they said about this syndrome. So, but after 1815, what we have with the Industrial Revolution is that wealth is growing, and it is growing most notably by investment at home, from which war is a distraction. So what happened basically since 1815 is not that war has become more costly, it is that peace has become more profitable. So once you embark on the road to modernization, to industrialization, it pays much more to invest in this than to go to war.
So another big reason would be the development and the access by the part of the several states that we have to the international economic market.
Exactly. But this again is a function of the Industrial Revolution. That is, before the Industrial Revolution, producers produced mostly for their own consumption. You were a peasant, you grew, say, wheat, and you had 2 cows and perhaps a few chicken, and you consumed what they produced, and only the margin was marketed, was sold on the marketplace. But once we have industrial production, nobody, in fact, consumes what it produces. Very hard to find. What we do is that we are cogs in a vast productive machine. We produce some products which we do not consume, or services which we do not consume either, and we, in a way, sell them in the sense that we get a salary for what we produce. So once production is entirely directed towards the market itself, that is exchange of goods and services, balloon. in comparison to what they were before the industrial age, in pre-modern times. So the significance is that much stronger. As John Stuart Mill said in 1840 something, he said, in the past, the patriot didn't have to care much about, his neighbor. If the kingdom of China was gone, it made no difference to him. Or even, if it was English, if France was gone, all the better. But now, our neighbors, other countries are our clients. We produce to them, we buy from them things that are of value to us, we sell to them. So this interconnectivity in terms of trade also is a function of the Industrial Revolution and the huge change that it brought.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that another big role has been played by political diplomacy at an international level? So, for example, the role played by the United Nations?
I don't know about the United Nations per se. Its effect was obviously limited, but has been obviously limited. But I would say that international politics, by and large, reflected the rationale that I've just outlined. It's not that people are always able to conceptualize the change, that is, to explain it in the terms that I've just suggested, but they nevertheless feel the fundamentals in the sense that they feel that it's not in their interest in the developed world to fight, that it's better for them to do business with each other. And they also believe that this is the natural order of things. It wasn't. It wasn't before the modern rationale, emerged. So the political process, what the people feel, and what the leaders, the policies that the leaders are pursuing in the developed world are such that they reflect this rationale. So what we have basically is the rather startling phenomenon that most people do not appreciate, that in the developed world, that is, say, in countries with production per capita of $20,000 and upward, in the developed world, say North America, in Western Europe, in East Asia, in East Asia, like in developed countries like Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, war has practically disappeared. In its two manifestations, there are no wars between states, and there are no longer civil wars. People do not appreciate these facts, but there are no civil wars either in these states, even though there might be, ethnic, ethno-national differences, but there are no civil wars anymore. Whereas in the less developed parts of the world, we still see war, and in the least developed parts of the world, say in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in the Middle East, we still see wars waged either between undeveloped countries or between developed countries and undeveloped countries. But between developed countries, we no longer see war. We no longer see the fear of war, the famous security dilemma. So, for example, imagine that Belgium and Holland no longer fear a German invasion. They no longer fear a French invasion. This is historically unprecedented. And I'm sure that in Portugal you no longer fear a Spanish invasion. Historically, against the large sweep of history, this situation is unprecedented. And in the same way, people do not give themselves and do not pay attention to the fact that nothing, in fact, protects Canada from being taken over by the States. At least the Canadians do not feel this possibility at the least. And the same in East Asia. Japan, Taiwan, South Korea do not at all fear war between themselves or with any other developed countries. The only fear of war that they have is with China, which is still far behind in terms of development, even though it's developing fast, and North Korea. So in the developed world where the rationale of modernity is fully in place, war has practically disappeared.
Okay, so we already talked about the long peace. Could you explain to people what is the new peace about?
I don't think that the new peace is different from the long peace or from the modern peace. The new peace is not one of the concepts that I use. The new peace is what people have noticed has been occurring since the end of the Cold War. But I don't think this is as significant as the modernization piece that I've just outlined.
Okay, and what is the importance we should give to terrorism and terrorist attacks in the modern world?
In the form that we have been used to, the effect of terror has been mostly psychological. It doesn't mean that such psychological effect is not significant. Obviously, it's significant, and people are very much worried about this. But the actual numbers of those killed by terror is low. It has been pointed out, a bit humorously, that more people are drowned in the bathtub than those killed in terror, and that more people die by falling from ladders, and all sorts of funny statistics like this. Now, people are not aware of this, and when asked what the actual causes of death are, they list terrorism high, whereas it's actually very low. Even in my country, in Israel, the number of those killed by terror acts is relatively low. Terror might become a much more significant cause of death if it ever resorts to unconventional weapons. That is, if it ever, puts its hands on nuclear devices, or perhaps even more dangerously, if it gets or develops biological weapons, which can spread disease epidemics against which there is little immunity, or even synthesize bugs or viruses or bacteria that at present we have no immunity against them. So anthrax and the like are among the epidemics that state fear might fall in the hands of terrorists, and thereby render them much more dangerous as they are today.
And what would you say is the importance of the war that is going on, that has been going on in Syria, in the world stage?
We don't know. It's a tragedy for the Syrians. Obviously, it's has been quite horrendous in terms of both deaths. There is 500,000 dead by now, around 500,000 dead, and there are millions and millions. About a third of the Syrian population has become refugees. Part of them in their own country, part of them outside, and obviously, it also affects the waves of immigration to Europe and other places. And it's now with the involvement of Russia, it signals the resurgence of Russian assertiveness on the political arena, and with Iran involved, it creates tension with the Sunni states of the Middle East, Arab states of the Middle East, and obviously with Israel. So all this already has an effect on Syria. It may deteriorate into conflict that is, encompass larger parts of the Middle East, may signal some developments in terms of the relationship between the great powers, that is Russia and so forth. But it's an ongoing event. We don't know what the future is. We'll have to wait and see. You know what Zhou Enlai, the Chinese communist leader in 1970, he was asked about the significance of the French Revolution, and he said, "Too early to say." So with Syria today, obviously, it's too early to say. It has the potential.
Exactly. So, and what do you think is the significance of this most recent development coming from the Koreas in terms of this manifested commitment of North Korea to denuclearization?
Look, I don't have insights that you cannot read in the newspapers. I mean, about the current events, I'm as intelligent or stupid as the rest of humanity, of newspaper readers, and if you watch television and so forth. What I study is more the fundamental long-term development. I cannot predict tomorrow, and it's nobody can. And studies show that laymen and experts are equally unsuccessful in predicting the future. So I have no pretense of being able to predict what will happen here and there, except for the usual judgments that people exercise all the time in looking at the current events.
And so, would you say that if we keep following these recent trends in terms of war, that possibly in the future war could become an obsolete political endeavor, let's say?
I'm saying that it has already become so in the most affluent parts of the world, in the most developed parts of the world. So as I said, in North America, in Europe, in the developed parts of East Asia, this is already a reality. It's unimaginable to the people involved that they would ever fight against other developed countries, against their neighbors. And mind you, most wars takes place historically between neighbors. Now it's unimaginable that France and Germany would be at war with one another anymore. So I think that it's already happening, has been happening in the developed parts of the world. Now, to the extent that the rest of the world is going to embark on the road to development and would become developed and affluent and very comfortable. The logic is very simple. In addition to what I've already said, if you already have all the luxuries and good things of life, why risk them and go to war? That's what people feel. They have fun. They have everything. I mean, they have opportunities, entertainment, everything. So they don't find the reason why they should risk not only their life, but their health, the difficulties and dangers and the physical exertion of the battlefield. They have everything at home.
Great. So just before we finish, Dr. Gat, could you please tell people, I don't know if you want to share with people perhaps something you're working on right now, maybe a new book, I don't know, and tell people also where they can follow your work, and I don't know if you're active on social media or not.
I'm not active on social media, and my work is in the books that I write. So people can easily find my books, and if they are interested. The work that I'm doing now, I'm fascinated by the phenomenon of ideological fixation, how fixated people are in their ideological convictions. And I've been so even before the election of Trump and all the talks about and all the divisions of on ideology in the American arena and the division, the increasing Gulf tensions, ideological tension in Europe and so forth. So as I said, I'm fascinated by this phenomenon. I want to explore it further. So I've begun work on a book on this subject.
Mm-hmm. So could we expect a new book in the near future?
It depends how you define near. It will take a few years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Gat, I would like to thank you a lot for sparing a bit of your time to being here with us today. I hope you keep up with the good work, because I'm really a big fan. And so, again, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really thank you for this invitation and for the very good, very informed question that you asked.
Okay, thank you. So
Very
have a nice Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.